Hello, my name is Chris Jones. I work with Leigh, Hilton, PLLC, and I'd like to speak briefly with you today regarding buy-sell agreements. Many clients that I've dealt with over the last 20 plus years have operated their businesses or held investments through either limited liability companies, corporations, partnerships, and with respect to all of those, we have going in a kind of euphoria of here's a new business, I can't wait to get going. Maybe I have partners or maybe I'm doing it on my own. Maybe partners come in later. But the primary issue, while it's not always thought about at the beginning, it needs to be. And that is, if things change, if the ownership structure changes, what do we do? How do we handle disagreements? How do we handle a death of an owner? How do we handle the disability of an owner? What if one of the owners goes through bankruptcy? Or what if one of the owners simply wants to leave? All of these are issues that can literally, and I've seen it, wreck a company. And so the time to be thinking about it is when you begin a company, or if you've got a company that you're the sole owner of, if you bring on a new business owner as a partner, or if you're looking to have kids come on board and work in the family business. That's another key situation where you want to look at how you're going to handle the business transition planning from one generation to the next. So the way it's typically done is to set up some type of buy-sell agreement. It can be done within the operating agreement of an LLC or the partnership agreement of a partnership or the shareholders agreement of the corporation, or it can be a standalone agreement. Typically what this allows for is it gives you a mechanism for the buyout or transition out of one of the owners. Let's talk about a few different ways it can be done. You can have a provision which is called a cross-purchase provision. What does that mean? It means that within the agreement, it allows for one partner to buy out the interest of another partner. Now, this could be under what's called a push-pull type arrangement where one partner can say, I want to buy you out, and they'll make an offer, and if the other partner accepts it, then they'll come to an agreement on how to pay out if one hasn't already been set up. Or it could just be a situation where one partner says, I want to leave, and the other one says, that's fine, I'll buy you out. It can also come into play in those earlier situations I mentioned. If there's a death in the family, you can trigger a cross-purchase where the remaining members will step in, or the remaining partners, and buy that interest. We usually do that where there's a requirement that that interest be sold. So for an example, I had a client who there were two owners. One of the partners died, and so we had a provision in the agreement that allowed the other partner to make an offer, a right of first refusal, and buy that interest from the other owner. In that situation, we had a valuation done and payment was made, and we'll talk a little bit more about how you can structure those payments in a moment. Another type of buy-sell agreement would be an entity purchase, where in one of those situations, death, divorce, bankruptcy, etc., the company steps in and redeems or buys out that owner's interest. And then you reallocate among the remaining owners. The third would be a hybrid of that, where you give an option. For example, I had a client who was in the oil and gas industry. There were three of them. One of them died, and so the remaining two partners wanted to purchase, but they didn't have the cash to do it. They wanted to buy out the surviving spouse in that situation. It would work the same, whoever's going to inherit that interest. And so the company itself bought out that partner's interest. And so you can do it that way. And the final one is what we call kind of a wait and see buyout provision. In this situation, you see it a lot with family businesses or with businesses where both owners have children involved in the business, where they say, okay, we're not necessarily going to trigger a right of first refusal and buy out that interest because we know they've got kids who are involved and want to stay involved in the company, but let's see how it goes. And so we'll put in provisions where we can buy it out if certain thresholds are met, or if they just decide they want those children out or that spouse out. A lot of times where I've seen this, it's been in the situation of divorce, where you've gotten a divorce, and if the property, the ownership interest is not separate property to the owner, the current owner, you don't necessarily want a divorced spouse in as an owner of your company. The way we typically structure that is the divorcing owner will have a right of first refusal to buy out that interest if it's awarded to the spouse. Otherwise, either the company can buy that interest or the other members can buy that interest, but there's a requirement that the entire interest is purchased. So you can see it gets more complex depending on the circumstance. So we've got these 4 basic types, but there are some other things that come into play. What if I've got an owner who just wants to leave? Most partnership agreements or company agreements do not allow an owner to just say, I want to be bought out. And there's good reason for that. What if the cash flow isn't there to buy that interest out? In that situation, they may want to leave, but nobody can afford to buy that interest out. So you would have to look at how to structure that buyout. It could be done through distributions from the company over a period of time. You could do it through promissory notes. In a number of my agreements I've set up where somebody, if they leave, and this could be for any reason, it could be the buyout at death, it could be buyout because of disability, any of those scenarios as well, we say the company can purchase and they can pay it off over a 3-year period or a 5-year period or a 7-year period. And the reason for doing that is you don't want to basically bankrupt the company to buy out an interest. And the individual owners may not have funds to do that themselves either. And so they would have the option to pay out over a period of time. Now, a way to avoid this would be you could have a life insurance policy on the lives of the owners. That would cover you in the event of death, potentially in the event of disability, depending on the plan, and that would fund the buyout. Another way would be to structure it so that the individual members cross-insure each other, and then they could directly purchase that interest from the other owner. But those are kind of the main ways to buy that interest out. What you need to consider is what happens if you don't have this in place. Well, if you don't have any type of buy-sell agreement in place, then you can really end up with a gridlock position in the company. For example, let's say I've got a minority owner who owns 40%, the majority owner owns 60%, the majority owner decides they want to sell the company, but it requires a supermajority, which is common, let's say 75% approval to sell the company or sell all the assets of the company or enter into a merger, all different kinds of things. At that point, the minority owner could say, well, I'll only go along with it if I get 50% of the proceeds. For lack of a better term, they can extort the other owner who really wants the deal to go through. And so we can put in, along with this buy-sell agreement, what we call tag-along, drag-along rights, which says if a majority decides to enter such a transaction to sell the company, then the other owners must go along and must sell at the price that is agreed upon for the value of the entire company. They can't take a disproportionate share. It's very important to have those types of provisions if you're building up a company and expecting it to grow which most everybody, when they begin a company, that's what they believe. They're going to set the world on fire. So you want to be thinking about that on the front end and really be thinking about, I know everything's great now, but what if? Worst case scenario is always to be taken into account at the beginning of forming a company. And these buy-sell agreements, these push-pull, drag-along provisions are all ones that need to be contemplated. Well, I know many of you watching this video are probably thinking, well, I don't really have a family business. I'm not in business with other owners. One thing to consider, it's not always about an operating business. I've seen plenty of family limited partnerships formed, those to handle, for example, a large piece of property that's been in the family for generations. And so it's been split up, undivided interest owned by different family members, but it's all held within a family limited partnership or an LLC to keep it all together. What can happen is, on the death of one of the members of that LLC, you may have the next generation come in and say, well, we want to cash out. We want y'all to sell the property and we want our piece. If there's no provision in place, then if they're the minority owners, then again, you've got the situation of them when you do finally go to sell saying, well, I wanted to sell back then. I want a larger cut now if you want me to go along with it at this point in time. So having that buy-sell agreement in place, even when it's just family members, and to be honest with you, some of the nastiest ones I've seen have involved closely held businesses owned by family members. To have this type of provision in place can help transition that, because you take the emotional charge out. You've already got all the mechanisms in place for, no, this is how we're going to do it. If we buy you out, we can buy you out over a period of years so that we don't have to come up with the cash, let's say. Or we're just not going to sell. You have no say in it, but we've got the tag-along, drag-along provisions in the agreement which say if a majority want to sell, you have to sell, and you have to sell at the price that the majority comes to an agreement on. So don't just think of this as, oh, well, this only applies if I've got my concrete mixing company or my oil and gas company. This applies also where you hold investments, and it becomes very important when you're talking about the family situation. I was dealing with a client recently who you had the first generation had built up the company. You had one son who was involved in the company. He was in his 30s. He'd been in it all his adult life. The other two kids had no interest whatsoever in the business. And so the concern was everything under their trust, they had put everything into a trust, everything under the trust was going to be split a third, a third, a third, which is fine if you have the assets to say, well, son number one who works in the business, you get the company and everybody else takes cash of a equal value to their share of the company in exchange. Problem always arises, what if there's not enough cash to make them whole so that they actually get their full third and he gets 100% of the company? So having this provision in place, we were able to say, okay, they'll take part cash and we'll redeem out. The son will get a portion of what their ownership interest would be in the company. As to the rest of it, under the agreement, the remaining brother and the company each had the right to buy out the balance from those children, those other two children, over a period of 7 years. And so that way, nothing had to be sold off to be able to settle with those two other children. The company was able to, over time, slowly pay off their share. And there was no room really for argument because the parents had set this up beforehand with keeping in mind they wanted to preserve the company. They did not want to have to sell the company. They did not want to over leverage the company so that it had problems just surviving and operating. And so that's something that we always want to look at. And keep in mind, we're talking about this as you should do this at the beginning, but you can always do this any point down the road as long as you can get everybody to agree to make that type of modification. So I always say it's better to do it up front while everybody's happy. We're all in our kumbaya moment, and just say, typically what I do is I say, I'm hired as a lawyer. You've asked me to do this. My job is, what are the worst case scenarios? Let's go ahead and plan for those. And I find that it gets resolved much easier that way because, one, they can blame me for coming up with these, as they would think, crazy ideas that we're not going to get along at some point. And two, it's just much more easy for them to sign off on something while they're happy. It's that simple. So just in summation, you really need to think about when you're starting a business, or if you've got a business that's been going for a while and perhaps you're starting to think of retirement or transitioning the kids or bringing in a new owner, a new partner into the venture, you really need to be thinking about, what if things don't go to plan, or what if I pass away? How is this all going to be handled? How are we going to set it up so that there is little to no problem on the back end trying to transfer these interests and transition the company and keep the company viable and keep the assets viable? I've enjoyed speaking with you today. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. We'd love to talk to you.